everybody, and welcome to World of Paleoanthropology. You're with me, your host, Seth Chagi, and today we're here with Professor Chris Stringer. And let him introduce himself for a little bit.
Right, yeah. I work at the Natural History Museum in London, although currently I'm in lockdown in Kent, but normally I would be in my office at the Natural History Museum in London. I worked there for many years. I first went there on the permanent staff in 1973. So, yes, a long while ago. Um, and I'm a researcher in human evolution, which means that some of the time I actually am hands on fossil material. I work with people who conduct field work, looking for new fossils, looking for archaeology. I used to direct excavations myself. Now I'm happy to leave that to other people. Um, and I collaborate with a number of people around the world in different areas, such as dating sites and dating fossils, such as looking for ancient DNA, such as analyzing not only the fossil material but also the archaeological material. So, you know, I've got quite a broad view of human evolution and human origins, and I think that's one of my strengths is that I think broadly. So maybe I'm a bit shallow. Maybe I don't have much depth, but I have a lot of breadth.
Well, I also think that is a great way to go about it. And, before we go any further, I just have to say, I don't think there's any anthropology book that's modern that I have read, especially one considering Neanderthals, that you are not mentioned in. So I am, your work is very, prolific in the community. And I just want to thank you for everything you've done and for that broad perspective, because it is different than a lot of people who focus on one specific thing or, something like that. So what brought you to human evolution?
Yeah, so I always had an interest as a child in fossils, as many do today. So yes, dinosaurs, and fossil material. And as a kid, even as a 5-year old, I was starting to look for fossils on the beaches and things. And then, I became interested in human evolution, and I did a project at school on the Neanderthals when I was about 9. So
Mm,
that interest was there even then, and it was stimulated by teachers who helped me with that. There were BBC radio broadcasts in those days, a series of programs called How Things Began, and it went through the whole history of life on Earth. And there were these posters of dinosaurs and even one of Neanderthals burying a child, based, as I now know, on evidence from the site Teshik Tash in Uzbekistan. I didn't know that at the time, but that really made a mark on me. So here was a supposedly primitive human burying their dead. So that appealed to me. So I did this project on Neanderthals, but I didn't imagine that I could, get a job working in that area. So at school, I was on track to go to medical school, and I had a place at London Hospital Medical School. And at the last minute, it really was virtually like that. I found out there was a subject called anthropology that I could study at university. No one had told me about that before. Um, and it really appealed because obviously there was human evolution in there, there was genetics, there was archaeology, social anthropology. So it was very broadly based. And the more I thought about it, the more that appealed to me rather than, training to be a doctor. And that was more or less the rest of my life mapped out. If I was successful, I would be a doctor, I would be in medicine. But anthropology appealed to me because it was very broad and it gave me a chance to get into this area of human evolution. So I was lucky enough to get a place at University College London. My parents, although they were a bit puzzled about this subject called anthropology that they'd never heard of either, they backed my decision. Um, and again, it was at that stage I never imagined I could get a job in that area. But again, I got lucky with um, money for a PhD in Bristol, and I did that on comparing the skull shape of Neanderthals and modern humans. So I was testing this idea that the Neanderthals were our direct ancestors, which was probably the dominant view in 1970 when I began my PhD. Um, and by 1974, I'd finished the PhD and I'd got my job at the Natural History Museum, where I've been ever since. So that PhD set me up because I went around Europe for 4 months driving my old car around, measuring fossil skulls.
I remember
Um,
reading about this
and I
somewhere.
got my, to actually touch some of these precious fossils, to touch the Neanderthal fossil,
Yeah.
the one that gave its name to the whole group, was incredible. So that was a great experience to have in my early 20s. And my PhD results in 1974 certainly didn't support the idea that the Neanderthals in Europe were the direct ancestors of the modern people that came afterwards. It seemed the Neanderthals were going off in their own evolutionary direction, away from the shape, the cranial shape of modern humans. Um, and modern humans, difficult in 1974 to say where modern humans had come from, but I was fairly confident not from European Neanderthals. I couldn't really at that stage say any more. But then over the next 10 years, the evidence, at least as far as I could see, accumulated that Africa probably was the place where modern humans originated. And then, of course, in the late 1980s, we start to get the beginning of genetic analyses that also point to a recent African origin for modern humans. So, yeah, that's the beginning of the more recent phase of the research where we start to broaden out and we get archaeological, genetic, and the fossil evidence coming together to give this view of a recent African origin,
Mm.
but of course not 100% recent African origin. That's also something of the last 10 years is that, if you'd have asked me 20 years ago, were we pretty well entirely 100% recent African origin, I would have said more or less yes, maybe not absolute. Maybe there was a little bit of interbreeding with people like the Neanderthals, but it happened a long time ago. It wouldn't be normal behavior. The groups probably didn't meet that often, and it was so long ago, any little traces of their DNA would have disappeared. So, in my view, it was kind of trivial in the big picture. So, we were nearly 100% recent African origin. And of course, that's not what I would say now. So, the genetic data of the last 11 years shows that we've got components of Neanderthal DNA in our genome from interbreeding maybe 50,000 years ago. And people over in the Far East and Southeast Asia also have an additional component of DNA from interbreeding with another lot of people called the Denisovans. So now I just say we're mostly out of Africa. More than 90%, if you like, of our genetic makeup is from an African origin.
And that is just fascinating, your journey through, you know, it's always funny. I talk to all these anthropologists who are big in the field, and almost none of them, except maybe a few, actually started out caring about anthropology.
Hmm.
Most people I've talked to, they always find it like last minute, or they find it, somewhere along the line. And I think that says a lot about the field, and something that I'm trying to change by giving more people access to the information.
Yeah.
And I think what you just explained was amazing. So now I'm going to ask you, so before I ask you, you were mentioning that, of course, we have Neanderthal DNA and we have Denisovan DNA.
Hmm.
Is it true, or is it still believed that there's a third mystery species we don't know about yet?
In terms of our own genetic makeup, yes.
Yeah.
So there is some evidence that even in Africa, there could have been interbreeding with a different human species, not Neanderthal, not Denisovan. So the idea, I think, is there, and there's some evidence for it that within Africa there was interbreeding with another species. It perhaps was Homo heidelbergensis, which we know was around in Africa as recently as 300,000 years ago. There's a more distinct species down in South Africa called Homo naledi, which was also around about 300,000 years ago. So maybe there were even other species in Africa that we've only got a very faint picture of at the moment. So it's thought that at least one of those did interbreed to some extent with sub-Saharan African populations. So they may have their equivalent amount of interbreeding with another human species. So that's possibly three. Some people think in Southeast Asia there could be evidence of interbreeding with another kind of human there, possibly Homo erectus, which was certainly around 100,000 years ago in the region and possibly later. But I was involved in an analysis published a few months ago of the data from recent humans looking at their DNA, and that did not find evidence of yet another interbreeding species. It found evidence of the Neanderthal DNA and the Denisovan DNA in Southeast Asian populations, but it didn't find evidence of something more distinct. But it could be there in very small traces. It's still possible. Yeah.
Right, right. So when we're talking Neanderthal interbreeding or admixture with modern humans,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of people think of Clan of the Cave Bear, for example. How off and or accurate was that for the time?
Yeah. So, I mean, to be frank, we don't know how this interbreeding happened.
Mhm.
So almost any account, has some
And yeah,
plausibility.
right.
Adopting orphan babies is certainly a possibility, for example, in these situations. So there are some people who think that these meetings between modern humans and Neanderthals were, yeah, basically friendly encounters that these groups met and they exchanged partners in a relatively peaceful way, and that's a possibility. At the other extreme, we've got the behavior of some chimpanzee groups and some hunter-gatherer groups, where if a group of males runs out of females, they will actually raid another group and steal their females, capture them, kidnap them. Maybe that happened some of the time. Adopting orphan babies is certainly a possibility that modern humans came upon some abandoned or orphaned Neanderthal children and adopted them into the group, and they grew up then in the modern human group. It's also possible that Neanderthal males hung around the outside of a modern human camp, and now and again the modern human women went out and met the Neanderthals and mated with them, had sex with them. So all of those things could have happened, and we really don't know. And maybe all of them happen from time to time because we're
Right.
talking about thousands of years where these groups theoretically at least overlapped. And we're talking about a possible range of geography from all the way from Western Europe, possibly over to China, where these groups could have encountered each other. And of course, if we're talking about Denisovans and modern humans, then the range is equally vast, but it's more a north-south range. It's from up in Siberia down to possibly Sulawesi or some other areas of the islands of Southeast Asia. So there were big areas over where this interbreeding happened, and any of those mechanisms could have worked in certain places. And I think as data build up, it will be possible to narrow down the possibilities of how these interbreedings happen. So with enough data, geneticists can start to work out whether the Neanderthal DNA was coming into modern humans mainly through males or mainly through females, or perhaps an equal balance of the two sexes. And equally for Denisovans, it should be possible to determine whether the matings were mainly coming through males or females or about equal. So that would help to balance out the scenarios a bit at least. If you've got equal numbers of matings, that might support the more friendly exchange of partners, for example. Yeah. But one thing is curious that at the moment, if we look at the Neanderthal modern human picture, we've certainly got evidence building up of early modern humans 40 or 45,000 years ago that have got Neanderthal DNA in them from fairly recent interbreeding. What's odd is we have got some late Neanderthals as well. Now, none of those at the moment show any evidence of modern human DNA coming into them within the previous few generations. So either the matings were predominantly going in one direction or there was some barrier to the modern human DNA coming back into the Neanderthal genomes. Perhaps some incompatibility, something like that, or maybe the matings were mainly going in one direction. That's something else that we don't understand clearly at the moment.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So speaking on Neanderthal behavior, can you dispel a lot of the myths real quickly that, and I call them Neanderthals when I'm talking about them, the caveman.
Hmm.
You know, like a lot of people still view Neanderthals as the big hairy caveman. What can you tell us about that view of them?
Yeah, so the Neanderthals were fully human. There's no doubt. The idea that they were some kind of ape man is certainly wrong. They survived till recently. Certainly until about 40,000 years ago physically. So they have a long evolutionary history. A lot of it shared with us, of course. Before we split from their lineage, we had a common evolutionary history until maybe 600,000 years ago, and then we started to go our separate ways. But Neanderthals were large brain. Their brains were as large as ours, slightly larger than the modern average. But when we look at contemporary modern humans, about the same in terms of brain size. And in terms of their walking upright and so on, they clearly were fully bipedal. They weren't stooped. They weren't bent kneed. They didn't have ape-like body proportions. Um, they did have some differences. Of course, they had a big brow ridge over their eyes. They had a middle of the face pulled far forwards, a big nose dominating that face. They didn't have much of a chin. So, in that sense, they're distinct from us. Their ear bones, even, are a little bit differently shaped, although apparently no implication there for hearing or speech. And their voice boxes, opinions differ on whether their voice boxes were more or less the same as ours. On some reconstructions, their voices would have been a bit higher than ours, which doesn't fit that brutish image, maybe. Um, but in terms of their vocal capacity, I don't think there's any evidence that they couldn't have made most of the sounds we can make when we speak. So, um, physically, I think they were capable of language, but because language is made in the brain, it's not made in the voice box.
Mhm.
And that's, of course, where we lack a lot of data. That Neanderthal brain is large, it's a bit differently shaped from our brain. What was its quality? And we really are, there's a lot of arm waving really about
Yeah.
whether the Neanderthal brain is essentially the same as ours. There are some archaeologists who are now prepared to say more or less modern humans and Neanderthals were equivalents in terms of their behavior. Because evidence in particularly the last 10 years, has built up that Neanderthals had many sophisticated behaviors which were comparable with the modern people who lived at the same time. So, again, 20 years ago, there seemed to be a pretty big behavioral gap between us and Neanderthals, at least for many experts. So Neanderthals lacked some of the symbolism, they lacked art, they lacked complex technology, composite tools. Um, some people question whether they even buried their dead. So there were many doubts about how much of our modern human behavior they shared. But most of those doubts have gone now. So we see that Neanderthals were capable of making composite tools, of mounting things onto handles, using adhesives, for example. They certainly mastered fire technology. Um, they worked in wood and bone, maybe not as much as some modern humans, but they did do it. And they certainly marked objects with engravings. So there's a thing called the hashtag in Gibraltar at Gorham's Cave. There's a marking on the cave floor, which, in terms of the sediments on it, seems to be a Neanderthal marking. So that looks like a symbolic marking. There are marks on cave walls in Spain, red marks and dots and lines, which seem to have been made by Neanderthals, maybe 65,000 years ago. I think there's still doubt about whether the Neanderthals produced representational art. For me, at least, there's no evidence of a Neanderthal carving a little depiction of a mammoth or of a human being in the same way as later modern humans did. So there may still be some gap there, but certainly when you look at the Bruniquel evidence, so that deep in a cave in France at Bruniquel, um, way beyond the daylight zone, so in real darkness, um, cavers discovered a structure made of broken stalagmites. So the Neanderthals, apparently, because this is about 175,000 years old, Neanderthals apparently went deep into that cave, which would have required, a form of lighting, probably burning oil or burning grease from bones to make lamps, taking that into the cave, collecting stalagmites, breaking them to a pretty much standard size, and then building a dry stone wall in the shape of an oval. So there are a couple of oval structures deep in this cave, apparently made by Neanderthals 175,000 years ago. And we don't know what those structures are for. Excavations will be made eventually in the floor of these structures, but it's not clear whether people actually were living down there in the cave, or was this maybe something for some symbolic purpose? Was it some kind of ritual structure? So there are big puzzles about that structure. I think possibly it could have been functional as a shelter, because this was in a cold stage, and the cave would actually have been relatively warm at that time. At some stages, apparently a river ran through the cave by the place where these oval structures are. So possibly Neanderthals actually were living down there. It seems extraordinary. They would have required, of course, a constant supply of light if they were really living down there for any length of time. So that kind of complexity is something that shows the Neanderthals were very human. They were very like us in many ways. So we shouldn't minimize their achievements. They were fully human. I would say human in a slightly different way, because they had a largely separate evolutionary history for several 100,000 years. So it wouldn't be surprising if their brain evolved in a slightly different way. If they had language, it would be, a language much more different from any language that people speak today. So, it's difficult to imagine what that's like. Perhaps if we could see them, we don't know, of course, how hairy the Neanderthals were. And we see these very nice reconstructions of them, but of course that's always got to have that element of imagination about how hairy they were. Did the men have a lot of facial hair or not? And so those things are still in doubt. And did the Neanderthals have a smile reflex? Obviously the smiling reflex is pretty well universal for people today, and babies, when they're soon after they're born, smile. We don't know if even the body language of Neanderthals would have been the same as ours. These are all questions which we can't answer at the moment, but interesting questions. But overall, yes, very human. Yeah.
Perfect. Hopefully that answers a lot of people's questions. Now, changing the subject back to the recent out of Africa um, theory, that was brought up by you and your colleagues, I believe, right? As in, you kind of headed that spear front. What do you say to the multi-regionalists that are still around today?
Mm. Yeah, so these ideas grew up really in the 1980s, and I was one of the people who developed this idea that modern humans had a recent African origin. And to begin with, I certainly wasn't talking about 100% replacement, or it was only in Africa, because the evidence was not really clear from places like the Far East. We didn't have the really good evidence that was building up in Europe. In Europe, I became increasingly confident that there was a replacement of the Neanderthals by modern humans. At that time, I would have said 30 or 35,000 years ago. Now the date's gone back a bit, but I would have said there's pretty well a complete replacement of Neanderthals, probably in Western Asia and in Europe. But I wasn't confident about what happened in places like China or Java. I felt there wasn't enough data. Some of the specimens were not well dated. So I was pretty confident we had a recent African origin. But to begin with, I wasn't confident it was a global picture. There was still some doubt for some areas of the world. But as the data built up and as the genetic data started to come in, for example, mitochondrial DNA, of course, so-called African Eve, published in 1987, there was some evidence from modern humans around the world, from their mitochondrial DNA, that mitochondrial DNA inherited through females traced back to a single woman who lived in Africa maybe 200,000 years ago. And that seemed to match this idea then of a recent African origin and a replacement of any other mitochondrial lineages outside Africa. So that kind of hardened my view, I suppose, strengthened my view. And then as we started to get better evidence that African fossils like Homo kibish 1, which for me is a modern human skeleton, evidence built up that skeleton was really old. Now we think 195,000 years old. So for me, that's the oldest modern human skeleton in the world. And also evidence accumulates that we've got even earlier, more primitive versions of Homo sapiens from sites like Jebel Ihud, for example, in Morocco. There we've got maybe earlier parts of that Homo sapiens lineage. So I don't see any sign of those early sapiens lineages outside of Africa. But on the other hand, there's the multi-regionalists. And so during the 1980s, the multi-regional view also developed in parallel with the recent African origin model. And in that view, more or less all of the ancient humans that lived around the world 1.5 million years ago, all of them form part of the ancestry of modern people today in the same regions. So you would have a progression in Europe from Neanderthal-like people through to modern human people. So if you had a complete fossil record, the prediction was that the brow ridge of the Neanderthals will gradually get smaller until it became a modern human brow ridge that we find in Europe today. The Neanderthal jaws would not have a chin, but if we had Neanderthal fossils, we would gradually see the evolution of a chin, which would lead to the modern human chin in Europe today. And there will be a similar progression in China from Homo erectus people in China. They would gradually evolve through to modern Chinese people. In Java, you would have a progression from Javanese Homo erectus through to modern native Australians. And in Africa, there'd be a similar progression from African erectus, maybe through something like the Broken Hill population, through to modern humans in Africa. But these would not be separate lines of evolution because they were interbreeding with each other across the old world where these populations overlapped. They were exchanging genes and ideas. And so essentially, it's the evolution of one species of human for 1.5 million years. So the multi-regionalists would say, we've got to call all of those things Homo sapiens. So there's no such thing as Homo neanderthalensis or Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus. It's all displaying the evolution of Homo sapiens. So that's the multi-regional view, what I call the classic multi-regional view. Evolution of modern humans basically across the whole world where ancient humans lived. They gradually are transformed with local evolution and gene flow into modern human populations. So that's the other extreme. I would now say we're obviously in a position where the extreme African replacement model has been disproved and the extreme multi-regional model has been disproved. Because clearly, most of our ancestry is from one place, and that place is Africa. As I say, more than 90% of our, genome is of recent African origin, but it's not 100%. So there is this degree of genetic continuity outside of Africa with these pre-existing populations. But to what extent, let's say, Homo erectus in China actually put its DNA into modern Chinese people, I think there's no good evidence that process happened. How much Javanese Homo erectus put its DNA through into recent Australian populations, again, I don't see any evidence that happened either. So, we had a common ancestry, as I say, with Neanderthals and with Denisovans maybe 600,000 years ago. That's still much younger than the multi-regional timescale, which requires a common ancestry over 1.5 million years of time. Yeah.
Well, okay. Now, I don't think I've ever asked anyone this, which is kind of strange because I've always wondered. What are your personal and or scientifically backed views on why Homo sapiens are the only ones to have chins?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I was impressed with the idea that, there is this need for a buttress at the front of the jaw. So in young individuals, the jaw is actually in two halves.
Right.
And then as we grow, it fuses together. So the idea was that, the jawbone flexes as we chew and it's under pressure. And this is a point of weakness at the front. And therefore, it requires buttressing. Now, in some species, such as some apes, you actually have a bridge of bone across the bottom called the simian shelf, which buttresses the front of the jaw. In some early hominins, such as Australopithecines, the whole surface area of that front of the jaw is maximized. You have a very thick jaw at the front, which spreads the load. So that's the theory. And the theory was that as we get shrinkage of the jawbone, particularly in the modern human lineage, the jawbone gets smaller, the teeth get smaller. There is still a need for a buttress at the front, and so the buttress has migrated to the outside and become the chin. Now, that always seemed a reasonable explanation to me, but a couple of recent studies have tested this biomechanically, and they don't find that the chin really provides any functional benefit. So, it's disappointing, but that idea, at least at the moment, still lacks good support. So I don't have an explanation for the chin. For some people, it's even just a piece of bone that's left behind, that our faces have retracted so much. The bottom of the jaw, in a sense, gets left behind as our middle face retreats. As the teeth get smaller, the jawbone is kind of left behind by the retreat of the middle of the face. So it's a possibility. But so, yeah, I don't have sadly, I don't have an answer for you on the chin.
Well, that just gives our viewers something to look forward to learning.
That's right. I mean, what's interesting is, of course, it could be a species specific recognition signal. So, of course, in some animals, there are features which mark them out as a species. So another member of the species can recognize them as a potential mate, and so on. And maybe this chin is part of that recognition signal. Perhaps the brow ridge was part of the recognition signal for some of those earlier species. Yeah, our high forehead would then become part of our recognition signaling system for Homo sapiens, along with our chin. Maybe, maybe.
Okay. Okay, that makes sense. And that's definitely going to be something fun to continue testing as we go forward. Now, I want to turn back to something new that came out over the last week. I can't recall the name of the place, but there were 9 Neanderthals discovered from a already discovered cave. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because you're going to know a lot more than I do.
Yeah, so this is from a cave site in Italy, between Naples and Rome, Grotta Guattari. And it's a site that's been known for many years for its Neanderthal fossils. So um, a very nicely preserved skull was found there in 1939. And it was found upturned on the floor of the cave. And the cave floor was littered with many bones and also with boulders. And when it was discovered, once it was lifted up off the floor of this skull, they noticed that the base of the skull was apparently broken open, and the skull seemed to be lying in a ring of stones. So this became, a suggestion of a symbolic behavior in Neanderthals, that some Neanderthals had maybe cannibalized this individual, cut open the base of the skull to eat the brain, and they'd left it in a ring of stones on the floor of the cave. So this was one of the explanations for why that skull was there in that condition. But then work in the 1970s and 80s suggested another entirely different explanation for the skull, that the damage on the skull was actually caused by hyenas gnawing it. And this floor actually was the floor of a hyena den. And later excavations also found two partial Neanderthal jawbones in the cave. And this material was thought to date between about 50,000 and maybe 90,000 years ago. So that's the story until the last few years. So the cave has been open at times for people to visit it. I visited it in the 1980s, and it was an exciting experience, having studied the Neanderthal skull for my PhD. It was great to go in the cave and see where it came from. But yeah, so this idea was demolished, and the idea grew that this was a hyena den. And that certainly seemed to be backed up now by the evidence from new excavations in the last 2 or 3 years, and they're not published yet. So we've only had these newspaper accounts really of the findings, and there's a very nice video out there of the site. So
Right,
this
right.
site's going to be very important. And as you mentioned, 9 new Neanderthal fossils. So this includes some bits of the skeleton and some parts of jaws and teeth, and a couple of bits of skull and one relatively complete skull. So they're saying that there are both adult and young individuals represented, probably both male and female individuals. So this is really exciting to have that many new Neanderthals from this site. So that goes together with the three previous finds. Now, because what we don't know is whether any of these new bits might represent the same individuals as already were represented by those three previously known fossils. So it's possible that they could be parts of the skeletons of the same individuals.
Mhm.
So we can't necessarily say there were 12 different Neanderthals remains in the site. It may be less once we compare them and decide that some of these are coming from the same individuals. But very exciting to have that. The skull really does look relatively complete. So we were able to look at the brain size and shape from that skull.
Mm.
If it's got the inner ear bones and ear bones preserved, then those could be studied. There's talk of the study of the calculus remains. So the stuff the dentist scrapes off your teeth, the tartar, if that's allowed to harden, it becomes what we call calculus, very hardened, and that survives on the fossils. And if you then are able to analyze it, that material will actually contain evidence of the bacteria in your mouth, potentially the DNA, particles of food that you've been eating could be preserved in that calculus. So, according to the accounts, the calculus has been studied already on some of these new fossils from Grotta Guattari, and apparently it shows a vegetarian diet. Now, that doesn't mean these Neanderthals were entirely vegetarian, because the calculus, of course, doesn't tell you the whole picture of the diet. It preserves those bits that are preserved in the calculus, and that may tend to be hard particles of nuts and seeds and so on. It won't necessarily be showing any evidence of meat eating in that calculus. So, but certainly these Neanderthals were eating vegetable materials, so that's not really a surprise. Neanderthals, like us, were probably omnivores. They were hunters and gatherers living off the land. They would have been opportunistic. They would have got whatever food they could, and if there wasn't much meat around, then they're going to have to rely on plant resources to make good that deficit. So I think the Neanderthals probably had a broad diet as we do, generally speaking. So these Neanderthals are really fascinating, and what's great for the future is, of course, that there could be DNA in these Neanderthal fossils. Um, and also another area of study that's opening up is actually study of the sediments of the caves. So even the sediments of caves where Neanderthals lived could have their DNA in there. So this may be from Neanderthal bones which have decayed away. It could also be where some Neanderthalers relieved him or herself in the cave. It could be where a Neanderthal woman gave birth in the cave, and some of her blood has gone into the cave sediment. So there can be DNA, even where you haven't got a Neanderthal fossil, there could be DNA of a Neanderthal if they've been in the cave at any time. So the sediments in Guattari could have Neanderthal DNA in them from perhaps parts of corpses that the hyenas brought in there, which is what seems to have happened with most of these remains. They seem to have been brought there by hyenas, but also at the bottom of the sediments from the earlier excavations, there were Neanderthal stone tools. So Neanderthals also lived in the cave, at least earlier on. And probably periodically, maybe episodically, it was Neanderthal occupation and hyena occupation. So there could be DNA from Neanderthals in the cave sediment. So this is all really exciting for the future. So I think that site is going to be one to watch in the coming years.
Awesome. And yeah, when I saw that headline, I was very excited. It's not every day you find something like this.
Yeah, no, it is exciting.
Um,
Yes, I'm looking forward to the proper full publication, which must be on its way from what they've already announced in terms of the dating and the calculus studies and the fossil remains. Yeah.
that's great. So what would you, let's see, I had a question. Okay, so I saw an article this week about the find, and the title of the article was Neanderthal Cannibalism Reimagined.
Hmm.
And what it was saying was that because of this find, it invalidated other Neanderthal cannibalist sites. What are your views on this practice and if it was really something they did?
Yes. So in terms of Guattari, as I mentioned, the interpretation from 50 or more years ago was that Neanderthal skull that had been found there had probably been cannibalized, had the brain removed and eaten. by humans. But then later on, already that idea was demolished by the greater likelihood that the skull had been damaged by hyenas and not
Mhm.
by humans. And the hyena had deposited it on the floor, and hyenas are not known to make nice rings of stone. So that was also illusory, that was imaginary, and not anything to do with a Neanderthal structure in the cave. So the idea of cannibalism at that site already was highly dubious, if not falsified. But elsewhere, we do have evidence that Neanderthals were eating each other. There are a number of Neanderthal sites with clear cut marks on the bones, even chewing marks where you can see the signs of human teeth chewing parts of those Neanderthal skeletons. So it certainly happened. It can't have been an extremely rare event, or we wouldn't see it preserved in the fossil record. There are quite a few examples now from the Neanderthals, but we shouldn't single out the Neanderthals because Homo sapiens also were doing this. There's a famous example from Britain from about close to 15,000 years ago. We've got a site called Gough's Cave
Mm.
where we've got remains of several modern human individuals, and they too have pretty certainly been cannibalized. The bones have been extensively processed, they've been disposed of alongside animal bones with the same signs of butchery. And these individuals have pretty certainly been cut up and eaten by other modern humans. There's a site in southern Africa called Class's Rivermouth, where you've got a frontal bone of a modern human that's maybe 70 or 80,000 years old, and that's got clear cut marks on it too. So modern humans at times did this. Neanderthals did it. There's evidence Homo heidelbergensis probably did it. There's the Bodo skull from Ethiopia, which has a series of cut marks, including in the orbits where the eyeballs were apparently removed. Homo antecessor at about 850,000 years ago in Spain. Those remains also show extensive signs of cut marks and potential cannibalism. So it seems that this practice was fairly common in the past, and we don't know, of course, the motivation for a lot of these incidents. We have a thing called crisis cannibalism, where people may have to eat other people who've died. There's tragic cases in recent times where a group of people get stranded, some of them die, perhaps up a mountain after a plane crash, and other individuals are forced to eat their bodies because there's nothing else to eat. So that's what we can call crisis cannibalism. Maybe individuals in the past died in a bad winter, and then the other individuals in the group ate them because this was part of their survival strategy. So maybe that happened. Perhaps some groups actually went out and as a dominance thing, killed other groups of humans and ate them. Some groups in the recent past have eaten parts of the bodies of their own relatives as an act of veneration. So, in a sense, you're keeping alive the courage and knowledge of one of your relatives, maybe your parents or grandparents. You're eating parts of them as an act of reverence, as a tribute. So that too might have been part of the motivation. So we shouldn't be too condemnatory of the behavior. There can be different reasons why it happens, even in modern humans. And certainly for Neanderthals, it may have had different motivations. Um, in some cases, it may even have been part of a ritual before burial, that some modern populations strip off the flesh from a burial before they bury it, because the living flesh is part of life. You have to separate that from the bones before they're buried. Otherwise, that individual will not settle after life, will not settle in the afterlife if they've still got flesh on the bones. So it can be part of a ritual linked with burial, and maybe that also was part of it in Neanderthals.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but the most productive, as in most fossils, site in Europe for Neanderthals is Sila de los Huesos. Okay.
Yeah.
So do we know how many individuals were actually found there?
Well, I think at the last count, it was 29
Oh,
individuals.
wow.
So
Okay.
you've got partial skeletons of 29 individuals, mostly adolescents or young adults. So it's an extraordinary sample. Every part of the skeleton is represented. Um, I think at the last count, there were over 6,500 human fossils from this
Wow.
pit deep in a cave. So again, a very puzzling accumulation. What's it doing deep in a cave system, right down a pit, which is very difficult to access for humans? Yeah.
Now, for this cave, do we know if there were like water entries or anything like versus the Rising Star Cave where they have no explanation?
Yes, so with Cima de los Huesos, it's thought that there was a cave entrance much closer to the pit of the bones, and there's this vertical chimney that's about 50 foot deep, which you have to go down on a little metal ladder, which was a scary experience I had a few years back of going down there. And it's really a small chamber. Um, no one could have lived down there.
Mhm.
And of course, there is one idea that these bodies were intentionally thrown down there. One view is that this was done purposely as a tribute. They were being accumulated down there as a tribute because there's a beautiful hand axe, a single hand axe made out of a pinkish rock, not local, that's been put down into, apparently thrown down with the bodies. So, on one view, that was a tribute to the dead. But there's also maybe a more sinister explanation that a number of the skulls have apparently got impact injuries that were made around the time of death. So
Mm.
possibly some of these individuals have been hit on the head before their bodies were put down into the pit. So in that case, it may be a more sinister explanation that these individuals, at least some of them, maybe there was a massacre, and the bodies were thrown down there. That is a possibility. So I think it's going to take a lot more study, careful study of all the bone accumulation to work out the best scenario. Um, are they closely contemporary? Which is, I think, the mainstream view at the moment is that all of these individuals were put down there at around the same time. It could even be one event that led to their bodies all ending up down in the pit. So I
Wow.
think that's uncertain, but it's certainly a possible scenario. But it's a fantastic accumulation in terms of our knowledge of the variation of the population, to have every part of the body represented in the skeleton, to have males and females represented is fantastic, and even DNA, because of course one of the leg bones from there has produced the oldest human DNA so far. So this is material which is thought to be over 400,000 years old,
Wow.
and it's even produced ancient DNA, which does place these humans at an early part of the Neanderthal lineage, which is what we already thought of from some aspects of their skull, and their teeth in particular look very like the teeth of later Neanderthals. So it looks like this is an early part of the Neanderthal lineage, and we've even got the DNA to show that.
Amazing. And now, is this site, as far as any non-fully modern human paleoanthropological site, is it the largest?
In terms of the accumulation of numbers, yes, it is by far the largest. Yes. So
Okay.
we've mentioned obviously Montecercio now, Guatrocatari in Italy has got, maybe up to a dozen individuals represented, but I think it'll be less once they've been studied. It may go down. Shanidar Cave has 10 Neanderthals, apparently, from Shandar Cave in Iraq. So there are some large accumulations, but the semen material, because you've got most of the skeleton represented, is really exceptional. And the closest parallel is the one you've mentioned already of Homo naledi from
Mhm.
Rising Star Cave near Johannesburg in South Africa, material that's close to 300,000 years old, where you've got again, thousands of fossils representing a number of individuals. I think on one count there were maybe 18 or 20 individuals represented there. So that's an important accumulation where you've got individuals from more or less newborn through to quite
Mhm.
aged individuals, um, still under study, of course, and still being excavated. So there's more material
Right.
coming out, and this enduring mystery there too of how these bones got deep into the cave. Was Homo naledi really going through these complex cave chambers in the dark to deposit these bodies deep in the cave? I think that's, for me, that's still not been demonstrated, but it's difficult to come up with a good alternative explanation at the moment. Yeah,
Yeah. Speaking of Homo naledi,
yeah.
Um, when no, I've lost it. So Homo naledi is, oh, okay. When Homo naledi was first announced, and all we had was the fossils and the anatomy, and not a date yet, where did you personally place them on the timeline?
Yeah, so I wrote a commentary when that material was first published, alongside that material, and I guess that in terms of its relationships, the material was maybe closest to primitive Homo erectus,
Mhm.
something like the Dmanisi humans, which of course are about 1.8 million years old from Georgia in the Caucasus. So in terms of primitiveness, Naledi for me seemed to be, comparably primitive. Um, so I might have guessed it could be younger than that, but I don't think I'd have guessed 300,000 years. I mean, we've got this extraordinary creature we haven't talked about yet, nicknamed the Hobbit, Homo
Right.
floresiensis, which was around probably 60,000 years ago, small bodied and very small brain. So the brain size of Homo floresiensis is only kind of chimpanzee brain size, and yet that's around 60,000 years ago. We can explain that perhaps because of the isolation of the island of Flores.
Right.
So if the lineage of Homo floresiensis got to Flores maybe more than a million years ago, it then went on its own way, evolving in isolation for maybe more than a million years, and it didn't have any kind of competing human species. And so it survived then until about 60,000 years ago in isolation with that small brain. But to have Homo naledi around less than 300,000 years ago in southern Africa, when, as far as we knew, Homo sapiens was certainly evolving in Africa at that time. Homo heidelbergensis was around, apparently not too far away in Zambia. So these much bigger brain human species were around at the same time. So how come Homo naledi was able to survive as it did in southern Africa? So does that mean that that area was isolated in some way? There were no competing human species, or did it mean that Homo naledi was partitioning the environment, that it was specializing in a way that made it not compete with those other human species if they were around? So we don't know the answer to that, and the small brain is certainly puzzling. So a little bit bigger than Homo floresiensis in terms of brain size, but comparable, up to maybe the size of um, a gorilla brain size or the smallest Homo erectus brain size. But we are talking very small brained. And I wondered for a long time, and I still wonder whether Homo naledi maybe had a low quality diet, that perhaps it didn't have the capacity to run and evolve a bigger brain. So it's kept that primitive small brain size for maybe 2 million years, and it never specialized in the kind of high quality diets that the other human lineages took up in order to be able to grow and evolve a larger brain. So Homo naledi might be a long lived lineage that didn't go down that, if you can call it, fully human route that we see in Homo heidelbergensis and Denisovans and Neanderthals and us, where the brain becomes huge, 3 times as big as an ape's brain. Naledi perhaps is a lineage that never went down that road. It developed a separate, maybe lower quality diet life without a larger brain, and it quite happily survived in that way, at least until 300,000 years ago. So that's an extraordinary story, and we don't fully understand it. We don't know how much it used technology. Um, there's speculation that Homo naledi could have been responsible for some of the Middle Stone Age tools that we find in southern Africa from that time period. I think we simply don't know what
Mhm.
Homo naledi was capable of. I would be very surprised if it was making some of the sophisticated tools of the Middle Stone Age, but I've been surprised before, so I'm not gonna rule anything out. A lot of interesting finds to come from there.
Awesome. And I think that is a great place for us to stop recording. Thank you so much, Professor, for coming on. I will hit the stop button right now.
Great. I've enjoyed it very much. Thanks, Seth.